In tonight's Dorchester segment, there's plenty of news about housing. That means everything from housing growth to market squeeze, from new heights to problems underground. To fill us in is the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Of course, Chris.
You're still recovering from YIMBY Town. Let's build more units somewhere.
Yeah.
But why is that so relevant to Dorchester?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the fact that the city's growing and that housing is booming is not really a secret to anyone. But for those who have been around for a while, it still kind of seems surprising that that's moved its way into Dorchester, where it used to be that you would try and live closer to downtown, maybe in South Boston. Dorchester, it's so big, and also there were areas that weren't really considered as first choice housing, I think is more how you would think about it. But now there's this housing crunch. Rents are up, housing prices are up, and Dorchester does have one really big thing going for it, which is the Red Line. So there are just major transit hubs that have gotten a lot more attractive, and compared to the rest of the city, even though you're seeing some pretty dramatic spikes in rent in Dorchester, it's still relatively affordable compared to Boston as a whole, and developers are starting to pay attention, and the city is starting to really seriously think about, hey, if we've got to build everywhere, where in Dorchester do we build?
Well, at the gathering in Boston, there was an intrusion from activists saying, you know, more housing is fine, but we need more affordable housing. So what happened?
Yeah, so this was a 3-day conference, the YIMBY Town Conference. It's a national thing they do every year, and this year they did it in Roxbury at the community college. And that in and of itself was a little bit of a point of concern for people when it started. They were saying, you know, Roxbury is dealing with gentrification. Why would you put this housing conference here, advocating for new units? And the organizers said, because, you know, Roxbury should be part of the conversation as well. If this is the neighborhood that's dealing with gentrification, and we're advocating a housing first approach to dealing with city growth, we should put it in this neighborhood and kind of be welcoming there. And on the second day of the conference, a dual conference that was happening at the same time with Housing for All members who are pushing for affordable housing, and more specifically for leadership in housing growth driven by the people who are most impacted. It tends to be, you know, lower income communities, communities of color that are most at risk of being pushed out by new development. And so they marched across Roxbury and wandered into the YIMBY Town Conference at the very last bit of the day and kind of shut the thing down. There was music. They spoke at length on the microphones, and they were basically sharing their stories of displacement and asking that the people that were in that room let them lead this fight, basically. And then after the whole thing wrapped up, the whole conference rather, a lot of the pro-housing or the pro-affordable housing folks then put out a pledge online that they asked the YIMBYs to sign, saying again that they would prioritize affordable housing and kind of cede leadership to those in affected communities. So that was kind of an interesting midpoint in the whole conference.
Well, another story is about a couple of towers on Morrissey Boulevard near JFK UMass Station, transit-oriented, and you know, some people in the neighborhood think, "Oh my God, that's too high." But did they really? Is this a surprise for people, or did they maybe envision something like this before?
Yeah, you know, off the jump, 22 and 25-story potential buildings sounds like a lot. If you think about the actual cityscape around the JFK UMass Station, really the tallest thing you've got there is this Hub 25 building, which tops out at 5 stories. But if you go back to the Columbia Point master plan that they initially did back in, I believe it was 2011, that they really worked on it, they were okay with actually up to 17 stories just right next to the station. And the Hub 25 building was actually a deviation from that. The market couldn't support more density at that time. So this really ties into the broader discussion of the city knows that it has to put more dense housing in certain places, and transit hubs are hypothetically most able to deal with that additional pressure. So if you have 25 stories, and again, that's preliminary plans, they're still going to go to the community. These are the City Point Center folks that have those and have put those out. They'll go through the normal process, but preliminary plans say that they are looking at 22 and 25 story buildings right there. And if you look at the people that could be occupying those, the place that's best equipped to handle it would be a pretty busy train station with JFK UMass right there. So there is, again, already this push back and forth with some neighbors looking at the plan and saying, not only is this going to possibly jam up traffic because they are proposing parking garages underneath these buildings, but it could also pose some risks because it might be in a floodplain. It's right off Morrissey Boulevard, and we already know there's flooding there. So it'll be an ongoing conversation, but we're looking at possible height.
Yeah, and speaking of traffic, this is right near Kosciuszko Circle, so
Kosciuszko
that's
Circle.
another nightmare, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would note one thing that remains really, really fascinating when the state and the city are looking at road planning. There's the ongoing redevelopment of Morrissey Boulevard, and now they're messing around with Day Boulevard, and both of those plans stop right at the edge of Kosciuszko Circle because they do not want to deal with that rotary.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, going to Dorchester Lower Mills at another transit-oriented location, a proposal for 47 units and a four-story building sounds pretty tame, but it's meeting with a lot of NIMBY. And why is that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of pushback on this project too, which really seems to be the through line when you're looking at the pressures in Dorchester. Is there are pretty ambitious proposals floated, and then neighbors say, have you seen how crowded our streets are already? So this proposal would go at the site of the old Malloy Funeral Home down on Washington Street, and it's a four-story building, but it was already very narrowly approved by the civic group. It was a pretty close vote initially, and there haven't been a lot of meetings since then. There's been some back and forth over whether the buildings that would potentially be demolished to make room for this condo project would be of historic significance. They're very old. There was actually a hold placed on the demolition by the Landmarks Commission while they assessed the buildings themselves, which has since elapsed, but the developers say they're not going to go forward and demolish anything until after they've come back to the civic groups and talked with them about it. And they will be back at Lower Mills in October for what looks like it'll be another vote, actually, to re-gauge whether the community is even okay with the project as it stands.
And what's the peak hour traffic like around? I'm thinking of Washington Street meeting River Street and Dorchester Avenue and Adams. I mean, there must be some snarls at some times in the day.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it follows a lot of pretty ordinary traffic patterns as well, which is like peak hours, work hours, going to, returning from. But yeah, there are some pretty snarly intersections around there that are already pretty jammed. So one component that the president of the Lower Mills Civic Group has said is he does like that the developers came back with people from the Boston Transportation Department to look at what can be done around that area, because initially they'd proposed doing and did bring in an independent traffic study expert, but civic groups can be a little bit nervous about independent experts. There's just kind of some skepticism. So I think there's a little bit more ease with the idea that the city transportation department itself is coming in.
Well, the backdrop to the housing and the traffic is the city's population growth. The figure they're now expecting for 2030, that is up from 1980 by about 35%. And I guess that's one of the reasons the mayor is changing his goals, right?
Yeah, so when they initially, back in 2014, took a look at the city, took a look at their housing growth, and they figured by 2030 the population would grow by about 91,000 over that span of 16 years or so and put you just over 900,000 people in the city. Well, they just had to raise that estimate. They did pretty much what could be described as a half-decade check-in on the census numbers and see how the population was growing compared to the original estimates. And by 2016, they were already 13,000 people off. More people were moving in than expected. The rents were rising more quickly than expected. So they're upping their housing goal. They're bringing it up from 53,000 units of housing by 2030 up to 69,000 units of housing by 2030. And one thing that was interesting in this housing roundtable that they had with journalists when they were announcing it is they're keeping a lot of the same ratios as far as the different housing types that they're trying to build. So they're still planning for a little bit more than 1 in 5 of these housing units, these new ones that come in, to be considered affordable housing, deed restricted. So they're going to kind of maintain that going forward, even though a lot of the new growth is in fact going to be more senior and also less wealthy, more financially vulnerable, even as much as everyone kind of complains about the wealthier yuppies moving into the city. A lot of the new growth is going to be on the lower income end.
And finally, some developers are going to spend more time in the pipeline because of problems with National Grid and its contract dispute. What kind of problems are these developments going to be experiencing?
Yeah, so if you go back, for instance, I know you've talked before about the lockout that's happening. So this goes back to June, basically, when they had an initial sense that there might be an issue around the contracts. So National Grid sent out an email to developers saying, hey, there might be some issues with the availability of contractors to do your gas projects. Some of them had already been approved to go forward with these gas lines. They were in construction. They were ready for it. And then they did follow up after the lockout started, after it was clear that there were going to be disputes, after there was going to be a shortage of workers. And I talked to two different types of developments in Dorchester because of this, where they were both notified that because of the ongoing labor dispute, they wouldn't be able to have gas pipelines in the ground until 2019. And they'd been hoping to get them in before the fall moratorium, where you can't dig anymore because it just gets too cold, which normally kicks in around November. So for these two projects, they called it traumatic. They said it was a disaster for them. With smaller developers, they've sunk almost all of their life savings into these projects to kind of build in the neighborhood. There's a Boston Home project, which would be a lot of affordable housing.
And accessible housing, too.
Accessible housing, yes, completely accessible housing. And they are almost completely done except for the sidewalks and the driveway where they just can't put the gas lines in. So what they're facing is either you go ahead, finish those up, understanding you're going to need to tear it out later, and then go in with temporary fixes, put in temporary heating units, bring in additional backup tanks, which is expensive and a pretty extensive permitting process. Because if you leave that thing without heat over the winter, I mean, you have all kinds of risks as far as water damage.
Plus, you've got that gas leak that the temporary workers can't seem to fix.
Yeah, over on Quincy Street. It's a grade 1 gas leak, and it's been poking around since, I think, mid-August, that they haven't been able to get it repaired. Folks have gone back several times, but again, this speaks to what Mayor Walsh and also union members are concerned about, which is a lot of the folks that are locked out during this dispute are senior workers. They are familiar with the streets, they're familiar with the pipelines, they could deal with these more complicated leaks. The replacement workers can't necessarily, so they're going back and responding to reports of these leaks, but they can't necessarily fix them. And I think one thing that should go mentioned is there is still an ongoing lawsuit between National Grid and the city over an ordinance that was passed in 2016, which was supposed to make it a little bit easier to coordinate gas leak repair in the city. So that's still wrapped up in court.
And finally, there are more things to come. So if people want to catch up with that, you've got the websites for the paper and for you on Twitter.
Yeah. So you can find almost everything we write at .news.com, or you can follow the paper on Twitter at .news, or me at jen.smith.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Of course.
Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter.